Hi, Todd Martin here. In this combined Tai Chi Code walking code video, we're going to look at grasp the sparrow's tail. In our previous videos, we have been going through the transitions from all of the movements in the Tai Chi Yang style 24 form. So far, we have looked at parting the wild horse's mane, crane cools its wings, brush knee, play the fiddle, and repulse monkey. In this video, we're going to transition from repulse monkey in the 24 form to grasp the sparrow's tail. In Grasp the Sparrow's Tail, we're going to see all 8 of the fundamental Tai Chi energies, even though only 4 of them are usually mentioned by name. The 4 that we see mentioned by name are going to be ward off, roll back, push, and press. But the other 4 energies are also going to be utilized. Those are going to be split, elbow strike, pluck, and shoulder strike. So we're going to see all of those movements demonstrated in Grasp the Sparrow's Tail. You're going to hear me utilize the terminology of torsional rotation and concordant rotation throughout this talk. So I am not going to revisit the meanings of those, but I'm going to post a written description of what they are so you can spend time looking at that if you have not already familiarized yourself with those terms from the other videos. Let's begin at the end of Repulse Monkey. I'm striking forward with my left palm with torsion on the left and extension of my left hip. I'm going to transition to the empty stance by changing my left hip extension to flexion, lifting up, and I'm going to take my lower torso root from the left to the right. I'm going to transition first using concordant rotation, going clockwise, turn the upper torso, so now I have torsional rotation. This gets me my cat stance prior to the step out. I use concordant rotation, going clockwise, and then turn my upper torso back to torsional rotation, and then I'm going to step out onto my left heel. I'm going to step out using torsional rotation on the left. So switching the torsional rotation from right to left is going to allow me to step out on my left heel. I'm going to step out using torsional rotation on the left. I'm going to extend my right hip, and my left arm is going to start to come up because of that extension energy in the right hip. Now I'm going to tuck my pelvis on the right, and that is going to complete the ward-off motion. In ward-off, what we're using, we have this powerful energy of extension of my left forearm, which is going to be warding off energy, and there's almost maybe a kind of mythical experiment people do or demonstration people do with ward off and how powerful that is at stopping an oncoming force. And when people do the demonstration, they use a relaxed arm that still does not collapse against the oncoming energy. That is possible because of the core movement that's making the energy happen. I'm not tensing my arm or my shoulder to create that warding off energy. What I'm doing is I have first extension of my right hip, which is pushing off the ground. So that's the first portion of energy. I have a energy moving backwards against a rooted ground that is not going to move. And so that's the first part of the energy. The second part of the energy is my lower torso is going to rotate. My lower abdominal muscles are rotating back towards that right leg. And that's also going to rotate the pelvis towards that right leg. As the force comes off the ground, this energy rotating backwards is in a sense going to be pushing off of the ground energy and pushing off of the hip energy, further extending that energy going away from the ground. Thirdly, I'm going to add my upper torso rotation, also turning in the direction of the lower torso rotation, which is turning in the direction of the hip energy, which is pushing off the ground. So I have 3 or 4 different energies that are providing that outward energy or expanse in my left arm. The ground, which the hip is pushing off, the lower torso, which is pushing off the hip, and the upper torso, which is pushing off the hip, all of that is reflecting in the energy of my left arm, which is now expanded out in a circular fashion. They often describe this as like a boat floating on water, that sort of energy, or expansion of a balloon, that sort of energy. That energy is not being provided by the shoulder muscles or the arm muscles. That energy is provided by the rotation of the upper torso, the lower torso, and the hip, all expanding or pushing off of the ground. There are 2 different ways to do ward off, and one of them is a direct way to transition straight into ward off. The other is a combined motion using pluck prior to ward off. When I step out from this position, I have torsional rotation on the left. One of the ways of doing ward off is to begin immediately by extending my right hip. And so now I have the upper torso turning towards the right hip, but I have my lower torso turning towards the left leg. And so that is pluck, not ward off. That's going to be the initial part of the movement, and it begins to lift my left arm up, but not in a full ward off motion. To complete the ward off, what I need to do is take the lower torso from the left and turn it to the right. And then now you have the full expanse of ward off. So starting from the step out, which is press, I'm going to have pluck and then ward off. It's all going to transition very quickly, so it's going to appear like one motion, but you will see the inflection point where I go from pluck to ward off. That is the transition between the lower torso turning to the left to the lower torso turning to the right. The other way of doing ward off, and this is the way that I was taught, after stepping out with the left heel, you rotate the left palm up towards the face while the weight is still back on the right leg. This is going to be elbow strike. What we're doing is stepping out with torsional rotation on the left, upper torso turning to the right, lower torso turning to the left. What you're going to see me do here is tuck my pelvis on the right. Now I have concordant rotation going towards the right. Upper torso is turning to the right, lower torso is turning to the right while I'm still flexing my left hip. That motion is going to rotate the arm upwards. And now I have both my upper torso and lower torso turning towards my right leg. All I need to do is extend the right hip and you have ward off immediately. So that is a direct motion into ward off rather than combining pluck and ward off into 2 sequential movements. At the end of ward off, I have upper and lower torso turning towards the right. To transition before rollback, I'm going to turn the upper and lower torso to the left, and that is going to turn my palms over, and then now all I have to do is flex my left hip and I have rollback. In rollback, the upper and lower torso turn towards the flexing hip. So I'm going to flex my hip and it's going to sink the weight back. This is, I think, one of the most misdescribed movements in Tai Chi because it is always described as turning the body to the right, because visually that's what you see. We see visually turning the body to the right, but that's not in fact what's happening. I'm actually turning the body to the left, upper and lower torso. It's sinking back off of that left hip that causes the entire weight to move towards the right, but I'm not actually turning towards the right. My upper and lower torso are turning to the left. Now when I transition to press, I'm going to turn the lower torso to the right, and then I'm going to complete that by turning the upper torso to the right. Now I've completed the transition and I'm ready to move into press. Now, how can you know that the movement is not turning to the right when you are doing rollback? How do I know that the movement is going to the left? Well, one of the ways you can know that is because in several different movements in the Yang style form, we transition from rollback to step forward and parry punch. When we do that, we start by the rollback and then we change weight in order to step forward and parry punch. When we change the weight, going back to the empty stance, then we are turning the upper and lower torso towards the standing leg, or towards my right leg. If I had already been turning to the right, there wouldn't be a movement left to do. So what I'm doing is first turning to the left as I sink back, and then I turn to the right to collect myself into empty stance as I begin to transition to step forward and parry punch. From the front view, we're rolling back. Everything is turning to the right. Now if I turn everything to the left, I'm preparing myself for step forward and parry punch. If I had not been turning to the left during rollback, there'd be nothing left to turn to the right in order to get myself to the empty stance. Now in rollback, I'm going to flex my left hip while continuing to turn my upper torso and lower torso to the left, and that is going to cause my weight to sink back. Now I'm going to transition my lower torso rotation, tucking on the right. That's going to begin the transition to press. Now I'm going to take my upper torso and turn it to the right, and that's going to complete the transition. So now I have flexion of my left hip and concordant rotation going clockwise. I'm now going to do press by shifting my weight forward, flexing my right hip, or lifting forward from my right hip and turning my upper torso forward on the right. I now have concordant rotation going clockwise. I transition to press by lifting forward from my right hip, flexing it, and using torsion on the right. Now I continue the torsion on the right and I extend the right hip, and there we have the opening of push. So I'm pushing open. Now I'm going to push back and down by changing the torsion to the left with extension of the left hip, and then I'm going to push up and forwards by changing the torsion from left to right and extending off the right hip. And that is going to be the end of Grass the Sparrow's tail. Now let me walk you through the 8 core energies or 8 fundamental energies of Tai Chi that we're going to see. We can start from the end of Repulse Monkey. We are in push with extension of the left hip. Now we are in elbow strike with flexion of the left hip. Split with flexion of the left hip. Press with flexion of the left hip. Pluck with extension of the right hip. Ward off with extension of the right hip. Shoulder strike with extension of the right hip. Roll back with flexion of the left hip. Split with flexion of the left hip. Elbow strike with flexion of the left hip. Press with flexion of the right hip. Push with extension of the right hip. Push with extension of the left hip. Push with extension of the right hip. There's one final movement in Grasp the Sparrow's Tail that is done in different ways, and understanding the different core movements can help understand why those 2 different ways exist. We're talking about the motion at the end of press and then the start of push where we open the arms. There is one version where we push down with the palms and then push forward. There's another version where we shift back and the palms kind of float backwards and up, and then we push forwards. The difference here is in the hip energy. When I push back and down, I'm using extension of my left hip, and it's pushing the body back, and then I reverse that and push the body forwards. When I float back with the hands, that is actually using the energy of press. I'm using the same torsional energy of the core, but I'm actually using flexion of my left hip from this position. When I flex the left hip with torsion on the left, it's going to shift my weight back like this, and then I'm going to extend the right hip into push. So the difference between this motion and this motion is in the energy of my left hip, either extending or flexing. That is the only difference. Neither of those movements is wrong. It just depends on what your energy of the hip is, and I think it is very helpful to know what the difference is so you don't think that there's an irrational or no reason why people are doing it different than you might be doing it.